Hello and welcome to the 9th episode of the podcast. I'm very happy that today I can greet Connor Tomlinson. Now, there's a lot to say about Connor. I think he's one of the most interesting up-and-coming writers and commentators in the United Kingdom. You can find his own show, Tomlinson Talks, on the Lotus Eaters podcast. He writes for the European Conservative. I think, Connor, correct me if I'm wrong, I think I've also seen your writing in The Critic, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that and also the Restoration Substack as of very recently.
Yes, so you're spreading in many ways. So obviously your audience is growing, justifiably so. So Connor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ralph. I appreciate it. It's a shame that we're not in person. We're parted by a continent, but I look forward to the next time that we can make fun of one another face to face.
Oh yes, most certainly. I can't wait either. The reason why I wanted to have you on is a very simple one. I very much enjoy your commentary on what's going on culturally and socially in the United Kingdom and Britain. I think you identify as a conservative, but only if you want to share this. I think you ran into somewhat of a kerfuffle, let's call it that, with the Conservative Party. Would you like to share it with our audience, or is it too private?
No, I've actually written a European Conservative article on it, and they asked me to keep it private, but then I just went and shared the emails to Twitter. So, short version of this, I was in the Conservative Party because the Conservative Party were the ruling party. I went every year to their annual conference to go and cause trouble and report on it for my audience. First year I went to report on it, I nearly got arrested for a completely ridiculous reason. It was to do with the UK's insane speech codes, and some police officer thought I'd offended an LGBT person. Never happened, and he didn't back off anyway. All the footage is there, it's very funny. The other year I then went and had a chat with Nigel Farage as he turned up and really upset everybody, so that was good fun. This year I was going to go, and it's starting on Sunday, but I received an email in July as I sat listening to former Home Secretary Suella Braverman's speech at NatCon in Washington DC, and it had informed me that I'd been suspended from the party pending an investigation with no specified reasons, and then a few weeks later they finally got round to doing this incredible archaeological effort and uncovered 5 tweets, which was quite impressive, and 2 of them were saying that they were wrong to expel now Reform MP but former Conservative Party chairman, I might have had the whip, actually, Lee Anderson, for saying that Sadiq Khan is running London to the accordance of Islamists because, you know, we have massive pro-Palestine protests every weekend and Wednesday at that time, and Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, has made a career history of defending Islamic terrorists, including the one survivor of the 9/11 attacks, so come to your own conclusions on that one. And then 2 tweets for saying that children should not be subjected to gender transition surgeries, social conditioning, or medical transitions. The Conservative Party objected to that, despite the commissioning and implementation of the findings of the Cass review before I had even tweeted that out. So, very weird. And then the final tweet was a joke about how maybe some of the new arrivals might not be so integrated into British culture, to the extent of where they may be doing unpleasant things like sleeping in doorways and defecating on doorsteps. And so if the Conservative Party think that that's a positive on the benefits of diversity, I'd scratch my head as to where their immigration policy, the intentions really lie. But anyway, so they said, oh, if you share any of this, then of course we will take your suspension as permanent. So I tweeted it out, and it wasn't very good optics for them. And as you can bet, I'm not at the conference this year. I'm going on holiday instead.
I mean, I'm surprised, I have to admit, because what did they expect that you would do? Anybody who's familiar with you and the work is, of course, that which is a good thing, right? That you don't shy away from a debate. You don't shy away from controversy. I mean, this is probably the most English or the most British thing that one can do, right? Differences of opinion is almost something that is, you know, in the blood of British political discourse. Would it be fair to characterize you as a conservative without a home? In a sense, is there for people that share your attitudes? And you, I would argue, are still part of the younger generation, of the future of Britain in many ways. Do you think that those who share your views are homeless in many ways, politically?
So my Twitter bio, before it has any of my various links, says reactionary Catholic Zoomer, I think in that order. And I would describe myself as a social conservative, an attempting Catholic, and of course, a man very much of his generation, a digital native who young men my age, as lots of Europeans, frankly, know with the AfD and National Rally and the Freedom Party in Austria, we just do politics in a different way. It's mimetic. It also changes much faster than the older, more sclerotic, more entrenched and institutional paradigms of the boomers, for example. And so, yes, my worldview is not necessarily represented in any of the mainstream political parties, and there seemed to be a chance that it would be represented in Reform UK with the return of Nigel Farage. Everyone knows Nigel as the man who spearheaded the Brexit campaign, essentially took down the Remainer Theresa May government, and then handed Boris Johnson essentially a mandate in 2019 to get Brexit done by standing down his candidates. Well, he was a very popular GB News host, he was a beloved figure, absolute meme magic, and especially beloved by the younger generations who liked his devil-may-care attitude. So Nigel came back when Rishi Sunak announced a general election with an absolute, just standing in the rain, looking like the wettest possible lettuce. And Nigel said, I'm going to come back and run in the seaside town of Clacton, which is pretty important because Clacton is full of left behind white working class people that moved out of London when new migrants moved in, and so have taken refuge in these sort of forgotten seaside resorts that nobody really visits anymore when they go on holiday to the continent for cheap. Nigel said, I will lead Reform UK and hope to become an MP. As soon as he went back, led the party, they shot up in the polls, Nigel was guaranteed to win, and he did. They got 5 MPs. And then ever since, Reform has professionalised. And what that means is a softening of rhetoric, at least in appearance. The first thing they did was depose Ben Habib, a long-time loyalist, the deputy leader, and replace his position with Richard Tice, who was the former leader of Reform UK until he stepped down for Nigel. He's also an MP. He's been very strong ever since the election, which is encouraging to see, and has taken Richard Tice, his friend, Paul Oakden, out of the role of chairman and replaced him with a man called Zia Youssef. Zia Youssef arrived on the scene about 5 minutes before the election actual day, turned up at Reform's rally, gave a speech about British values, and then gave a large sum of money to the party and was made chairman. I find him utterly unimpressive, and I happen to think, and so do lots of people high up in Reform UK who've spoken to me, happen to think, that he has been selected to act as one-man body armour for a political establishment who will always accuse Reform of being racist and Islamophobic because they notice cultural differences and the fact that Islam has not exactly been without its crimes and its controversies in adapting to Britain. And the other thing that Reform has done is soften its message. So Nigel Farage was interviewed by the excellent Stephen Edgington over on GB News recently. And when Stephen Edgington asked Nigel Farage 2 questions, he gave him very disappointing answers. First of all, he asked Nigel Farage, the white British population has fallen from something like 87% to 74% in the last couple of decades. Is this a concern for you? And Nigel Farage says, no, it's not a concern of mine. All I care about is culture. So Farage doesn't connect the fact that a culture is a story that a people tell themselves, and so you don't get culture without a people, and so if you have a reduction in the people, you have a reduction in the culture. And the other thing he asked was, do you support mass deportations? And Farage says, well, we need to deport criminals currently in prison because there are 10,000 of them. And Edgington said, yeah, sure, but on this issue of mass deportations, Donald Trump is pushing for this, and he's your friend, and he's very popular. There are lots of people on the continent pushing for this. Even Olaf Scholz in Germany is starting to repatriate some Afghan citizens after a series of terror attacks. There are currently 1.2 million or 1.3 million illegal immigrants in the UK as of Pew Research data, plus since 2018 we've had 130,000 channel crossers. So would you enforce the law and ensure that all of these foreign nationals go back? And Farage says, no, it's a political impossibility. And when pressed on whether or not it was just logistics that got in the way, and Edgington said, is it your ambition at least? He said, no, it's not. So lots of people are turning around and going, well, where is my home then? Because if Reform UK aren't willing to be strong enough on this issue, do I have representation? The last thing I will say is that someone seems to have taken notice of this. Now, the Conservative Party are not very trustworthy, because remember, they presided over this change in immigration that led to at least 1.2 million foreign nationals every year coming into Britain. However, there's a Conservative leadership contest going on at the moment, and Robert Jenrick, who, even after I have been thrown out of the Conservative Party, has not unfollowed me on Twitter, and who I have friends working for and advising his campaign, decided today and yesterday to come out with a policy announcement and a video saying not only will he punish countries who do not repatriate their foreign nationals, like India, by barring visas, because it turns out we have 250,000 Indians entering legally every year. We also have illegal Indian migrants, which I can only presume are serious criminals who would not be allowed in otherwise, as well as breaking into the country. But he also said that I will deport every single illegal immigrant in Britain. Now, whether or not that's a logistical issue, whether or not his party's with him, at least the rhetoric is there, and it's far stronger than what Reform is providing. So all we can hope is a right-wing arms race to provide young conservative Zoomers like me someone to vote for.
This is very fascinating. I forgot to mention at the beginning of our conversation, you also were in a very popular podcast in the UK, I would say by now globally, like on trigonometry. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, because I'm an avid listener to this as well. I think Francis Foster and Constantine Kissing do a wonderful job. So I think it's really one of the best podcasts out there. And recently there was, they had Sir Neil Ferguson on, right? And I'm a great admirer, great historian. I think he's not just a Sir in the UK, he has dual citizenship. And they had a conversation about, Britain, history, identity. And towards the end, it seemed to me precisely what you just described relating to Farage, that Ferguson showed a similar attitude, right? When he was asked about the matter of migration, he said, well, there's not much we can do, right? We need mass migration for the labor market. And he made a very, in my opinion, weird comment because he's married, as you of course know, to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who I think is probably one of the staunchest defender of Western values that one can imagine. So she might be Somali or African by heritage, but I think culturally she's fully westernized more than many people who are born here. But he also then had this weird sideswipe as his own children, where he said that his biracial children are much more beautiful than his other children, which I think is an odd thing to say. But I leave that aside. But it sounded very much exactly like what Farage, what you just described, is that you have conservatives with whom you probably as well as I do, I share 90% of their positions, that when it comes to the matter of cultural cohesion, of migration, they seem to swivel, right? You can almost see how they cringe in their seats, how the question alone makes them uncomfortable, and then they try to come with these evasions of, well, there is not much we can do anyways, and this is going to happen no matter what you do, and it's going to be good for the economy. Just a quick point I would like to hear your opinion on as well, because if we look at the data, yes, some migrants contribute to the economy, but some migrants simply don't. So just making the blanket claim that all migration contributes to the economy in a positive way is simply not true. So I'm often surprised that either people who have generally a good sense of how the people feel, like Nigel Farage, or people who are very intelligent, very smart, like Neil Ferguson, seem to take these odd positions on migration and cultural cohesion.
Yeah, so I'll address those in order. As for Neil Ferguson's comments, I did watch that trigonometry episode. I had Ayaan on my show on Wednesday, actually, and I brought this up and I asked her about it. And she herself, having known the kinds of cultures and environments that a large number of these people come from. I mean, for example, this was a stat put out by Robert Jenrick. In the last year, the UK gave out more family reunification visas for Somalians than visas for physicists, engineers, and chemists from every other country combined. Now, what's going to happen there is they're going to recreate the conditions of Somalia in small and ethnic enclaves and basically make micro-failed states in the UK. And we know that this is not an economic necessity because the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, the exact left-wing body that cooed out Liz Truss, by the way, when she made a marginal adjustment to tax rates, decided, and they keep advising immigration to increase. I think they set the mandatory number for immigration to increase from 245,000 to 315,000 every single year, and it's way above that. But anyway, so Liz Truss's tax cut crashed the economy, but the OBR then put out a report saying, well, actually, our economic policy of low-skilled migration has led to importing people that by the time they reach the age of 66, the pension age claim, cost the British taxpayer £150,000 each. Now, bear in mind, 80% of pre-Brexit migration was European. It's now 80% non-European. We know from Danish studies that Middle Eastern, North African, Pakistan, Turkish, lots of Sub-Saharan African as well, migrants, are never nat tax contributors, on average, across their lifetime. So they've been importing those people in the millions in the last few years, and they've just come out and said, well, it's not an economic necessity because it's actually a massive net economic drain. So for Niall Ferguson to say this, and for him to also make the birth rates argument, when one of the leading causes, I would think, at least the data I've seen, that's driving down birth rates is housing availability and the economy. So people like me can't get houses, can't get well-paying good jobs, at least, my generation, to start the families that we want. I'm trying to buy a house now, and I can tell you it's bloody awful, and it's not like my missus needs any encouragement to have kids, That's driving down the birth rates of the native population, so we wouldn't have this problem if we, one, sufficiently managed the economy, and two, didn't flood us with dependent foreign nationals. But the other reason as well is that, as you said, Ayaan Hirsi Ali has been utterly assimilated to all of the countries she's lived in, the Netherlands, the UK, the US, and she is someone that I would call a grateful house guest, right? And in order to have a home, the homeowners must not only remain a majority over the guests, but also they must reserve the right to both provide hospitality to the grateful guests and to evict the guests who decide to rearrange the furniture without their consent. And what we need is to distinguish those two groups. But the problem you have with, I think, some of the boomer conservatives that you've pointed out is that even distinguishing those two groups now is called racist. We've gotten to the point where not only is milk racist or the countryside is racist, but even noticing different behaviours between different groups of people, in aggregate, a culture, is itself racist. And this is the reason I think reform are softening. It's because they want to avoid this idea that there are involuntary aspects to national and personal identity. Because any suggestion, for example, that being of a certain ethnicity might incline someone to be more closely identified with a certain culture because you think it's your home culture, or especially if you're a second generation migrant, it's your parents' home culture, and if you don't feel that you necessarily belong in the culture you were born into but that you aren't ethnically a part of, then you identify even stronger with the home culture. That can create some kind of conflict about self-identity. But if you're a party that's constantly beset by accusations of racism, especially to the Nazis, because they are the great villain of the 20th century, for good reason, I think, alongside Mao and Stalin, which don't get enough of a say, then what you do instead is you immediately pivot to say, whoa, no, all national identity is consensual, there is absolutely no, not only is there no moral content, because there isn't, but there is no influential factors on national identity other than what you choose. It's just a set of values. It's just a game of cricket, as Richard Tice said at the Reform Conference. They go to that to avoid those accusations of racism. And it's like, okay, I'm sure that you aren't racist. I get it. I'm sure that you are doing your absolute best to disprove these smears and false allegations. The problem is, though, that's also not true. And that creates a false conception of national identity. And if all we think that makes a citizen, all we think that imbues a culture in someone is that they step through the passport gates and inhale the air of Britain and touch its magic soil, then that's going to lead to a very bad immigration policy, which is going to lead to crime, bankruptcy, and cultural decay. And that's what I think we're seeing right now, and no party is willing to address it.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit what the Dutch have been trying to do for a long time. When newcomers arrive in the country, they show them a video where, for example, two men are kissing and where a girl walks in a miniskirt, because the idea is that somebody from Sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East just doesn't know how it is. But if you show them the video, they will say, this is how things are done here, and then they will immediately integrate. As you said, it's the perception that citizenship or a passport is just a piece of paper. It's a legal status. It is not at all tied to history, to tradition, to a specific culture. I think you make excellent points, and I wholeheartedly agree. The surprising part, and I want to push you a little bit on this because I'm really curious about what you think about it. Why is it people that we generally would see as being on your and my side on the aisle on this, and that I think many people had high hopes for? I mean, as you know better than anybody, I think the reason why, correct me if I'm wrong, why Reform UK got almost 14% of the vote was precisely because people thought, okay, they actually have a backbone. They stand for what they say. They will not become squishy like the Tories have become. So they will stand up for British tradition, for Englishness, for Britishness, whatever then you want to call it. And now, as you correctly say, they seem all of a sudden have then this desire to become what we could call derogatorily an establishment party and give up the very things that made them for so many people electable in the first place.
So I know lots of people are going to say I am being insufficiently tactical and that they are just biding their time until they take power. I would like to remind them that currently they have power, they have a beachhead of 5 MPs, they cannot be removed unless they commit some serious misconduct, and so if the time to strengthen your rhetoric were to come, it's now, especially as various parties with much stronger rhetoric are making more substantial gains across the continent. But, yes, Reform gained 4 million MPs on the auspices that they were going to defend what I would say British identity, so the ethnic and cultural subgroups indigenous to the British Isles, the Celts and the Anglo-Saxons, which actually, funnily enough, Robert Jenrick has been talking a lot stronger about recently as well. Not that the Conservative Party are going to back him. And also to deport foreign criminals and bring the overall number of immigration down. And so to the people that say it's just a tactic, they're biding their time, I fear it's not. And the reason I say that is because I think that, like lots of the Conservative politicians, Nigel Farage himself is a Thatcherite. Now, that worked in a time and a place when you had a homogenous population and when the concerns were foreign policy and economics, when you were facing down the evil empire of the Soviet Union and you were battling socialist subversion at home. And I think you can actually see how this plays out pretty well with the Hungarians, because they have had their culture erased under the Iron Curtain, they had their economy destroyed, but they didn't have their demographics changed, and so they were able to rebound and are now very proud, very prosperous, and are the only country that's able to actually reverse this birth rate decline through strong state policy. What we have done instead is we've imbibed the kind of liberal anthropology that undergirded both Marxism and liberalism. So, for example, the heroes of the Reagan-Thatcher era. I'm thinking of Hayek with Road to Serfdom. He made his principal concern that Nazism could be replicated in other countries than Germany. And so, having fled it, of course, he's concerned about that. So he focused on maximum individual autonomy within the market, within culture, to prevent the rise of authoritarianism and to allow exceptional individuals to create a rising tide which raised all ships. His market arguments, absolutely sound. But the anthropology rests on the idea that human nature and cultural differences are purely products of education and material circumstances. Now that's a great and optimistic view of human nature, which is the antithesis to the hard-bordered Nazi racism, which of course Reform are going to be accused of. But it leaves out that part that lots of people do think that involuntary factors, be it sex in the gender debate, or be it ethnicity in the immigration debate, have a sway over what people believe, what behaviours they have, how they want to live their lives. And so because lots of the, frankly, older generation who supported Thatcher and are still talking about supply-side economic reform and tax cuts have brought that sort of anthropology to bear on modern politics, they don't understand the concerns of, necessarily, people that are having to live with the demographic realities, being around people that are unilaterally hostile in an ethnic and a cultural way to the native population. And so I like to sum it up with this phrase. Which Harrison Pitt, my co-host on Deprogrammed, relayed to me. In homogeneous societies, ideas are above identity. In heterogeneous societies, diverse societies, identity is always more important than ideas, because you can't discuss them outside a shared moral framework if the identities are in clash. And the problem we have is a lot of those older politicians in the Conservative Party and, I would say, Reform are playing in the paradigm of ideas or values, when unfortunately, because of the levels of immigration and demographic change, we're now fighting on the grounds of identity.
So I think I could, if I can summarize a little bit what you said in a more brutal, maybe, in a somewhat more brutal fashion. A society, if it maintains a certain degree of homogeneity, let's put it this way, can actually survive quite a lot. And I think you mentioned the Germans. The Germans are, of course, the ideal negative example when it comes to crimes and history, if you want. But I think they're also a good example that the country continued and the German identity continued to exist. So even the devastation of 2 world wars did not really prevent them from rising again in many ways, because kind of the underlying sources of German power, like their culture, their traditions, their identity, the good and the bad, if you want, of course, was still there. So the material destruction was horrible, but the substance of the people was still there. But that's different, of course, with mass migration, because that is not just a change in the material condition, only as a consequence. That is not a change in the actual, let's say, values that make a country up, that make an identity up, but it's a change of the population. Now, two things, and I know that you probably feel the same way about this. There is one thing is an evolution of society, because I know many people are listeners and watch us say, but come on, Connor, are you saying that the English and the British are the same now that they were 120 years ago? And I think the correct answer to this would probably be no, but that was an evolution of the British, right? It was an evolution of Britishness. But what we experience right now in many ways in continental Europe is a transformation, right, through mass immigration. And those are two completely different things.
Yes, so I would like to frame this slightly differently. So it's not just an evolution of, let's say, British values, but two things have been done here. The demographics have changed substantially. So we have had more immigration since 1997 than between 1066 and the Second World War. And so if you think that values are going to change because of that, obviously. But let's park that aside. Even if values had drastically changed without demographics changing, that wouldn't render it less English or less British. It's sort of canard. So I can set it up in this fashion, right? There might be a Nigerian man who has lived in Lagos all of his life, who is a wonderful chap, who I would invite to my wedding, who I would go to the pub with on Saturdays, who, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, has far more British values than Keir Starmer, and, that's a very low bar. But it doesn't make him more English, for example, than King John I, who he had to draft Magna Carta against, one of the cornerstones of British English values, to constrain his tyranny, because he is ancestrally English. He was born in England, his family are English, obviously the Norman conquest and all that, but he is an Englishman, whether we like it or not. And so we can possibly incorporate that new Nigerian neighbour, but it doesn't automatically make him English, and that doesn't make him inferior, it just makes him not a thing, and that is fine. And then all of this change should come organically from the desires of the people who have nowhere else to go if Britain were to fail. And the problem is that it hasn't. It has been a conscious ideological revolution waged by both the Labour and Conservative parties as established by Tony Blair. There are two ways to understand how this has been done. The first way was, I stumbled across this debate recently when I went on GB News, and former MP and MEP for Labour, Sean Simon, himself having a very Welsh name, denied the existence of an English ethnicity. And he said, we don't talk like that anymore, not in modern Britain, proper Britain. So even acknowledging the existence of an English ethnicity is verboten. Apparently there's Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and this big grey blob until the Windrush turned up and settled it like the Mayflower. So the idea is that actually what they want to do is recast British identity outside of its particular context of being a people, a place and a time, and have it as a set of values. And that means that anyone they import can automatically be incorporated into the British project and be as British as you and me, which both deprives the native population of the ability to complain about mass immigration and allows the state to pick and choose their client groups as they see fit to remain in power. And these values are always very pluralistic. They're liberal, they're tolerant, they're, carrying an umbrella to stand out in the rain, and not so much free speech these days. And, anything the state finds favourable to itself, and it can package as essentially what can be written on top of the biscuit tin. This is what Blair called Cool Britannia at the time. As long as you liked Oasis and the Spice Girls and waved the Union Jack, then you're as English as Robin Hood. And the other way it's been done is through a strategic plan to wage psyops against the British population. And if you think that's exaggerated, I've got an article in the European Conservative coming out about soon. I've done it on my show as well. People like Laura Dodsworth in A State of Fear have written about this. There is a unit called RICU. RICU is the Research, Information and Communications Unit. They have a program called PREVENT. PREVENT is the Anti-Terrorism and Counter-Extremism Unit, and they try to de-radicalise people and they monitor extremism. In 2023, a review of PREVENT was conducted, and despite 1% of the British Muslim population, that's 40,000 of 4 million, being on the terror watch list, which per capita is a massive amount, they spent more time monitoring far-right extremism. What was far-right extremism, do you ask? Well, they provided a list of texts. Any book by Douglas Murray, George Orwell's 1984, how ironic, The Lord of the Rings, C.S. Lewis, and Michael Portillo's Great British Railway Journeys BBC series. Now, if all of those things are far-right extremists, that sounds like a good Sunday afternoon to me, but The Quran and the Hadiths are not, despite being responsible for a large amount of terror attacks. You can probably see where the priorities of the Home Office lie. And what Raiku does is it uses taxpayer money anytime there is a Muslim terror attack. It consults with various NGOs and client groups and a 700-strong Muslim activist network that Stephen Edgington uncovered in the Home Office. And it busses imams out for photo opportunities. It runs prefabricated photos on the front cover of the Sun newspaper. And in 2017... it ensured that the grieving parents of the Manchester Arena attack were told, don't look back in anger. So the government centrally plans messages to de-escalate tensions and opposition to their immigration policy in the aftermath of when one of the diversity goes boom. So that is how the British identity has been redefined. It has been made a set of opt-in liberal values which make carve-outs and exceptions for the most violent and virulent tribal minorities, and anytime the native population complains, you're called far right.
This, I'm very much like the way you described this, but let me play devil's advocate for a second. If we take this hypothetical Nigerian that you described before, what about his children and his grandchildren? Could they become genuinely English, or is this a road that is forever closed due to the heritage of the original Nigerian?
Well, if he marries an English person, then they can become English. So the best examples of this are Ben Habib or Calvin Robinson. Both very good friends of mine. They both have... Ben's father is Pakistani, Calvin's father is from the Caribbean. Both of their mothers are English. So they are partially ancestry English, and both of them have said that actually made it far easier for them to identify with English culture because they have an ancestral tie there. And if you met them and interacted with them as I have, they are genuinely as English as you and me, despite their skin hue being slightly a different colour. And so that's how it makes it easier, not just...
I do appreciate that he always called me also English, which I think is a great honour, but I'm not sure if I'm qualifying.
You're honorarily English.
I like it. Okay, I take that.
But we still make fun of each other on the continent. But in the inverse, right, I would never be genuinely German or Austrian if I just came and lived in German or Austria.
True.
Even if I wore lederhosen and ate bratwurst on Oktoberfest.
And that sounds very enticing, doesn't it?
It does sound fun. Yeah. It does sound fun. And I have great admiration for the culture, don't get me wrong. When we're not at odds in the prior century. But if I married a beautiful German or Austrian girl, I mean, I think my fiancé would be very upset. But I think my children would become German or Austrian. And I wouldn't feel excluded or offended if someone said, well, you're a German or Austrian citizen, and you clearly love my country, but you're not German. I'd go, yeah, I know, but I do want Germany to stay majority German. I want the culture to remain predominantly German, and I want my children, my now German children in this fictional scenario, to grow up in Germany, remaining German. And I think that's what the likes of Calvin Robinson and the likes of Ben Habib want as half Englishmen with their children being English. They have ingratiated themselves through marriage, through culture, through a chest of friendship into the English tribe. And I think if we only acknowledge that those tribes exist and they have those tests of friendship, then it allows us to pick our friends and our enemies and evict the kinds of house guests that we don't want here.
I mean, everything you say, it sounds to me that was common sense. Maybe just 40 years ago. I think in the 90s it starts to come, but up until probably the 1980s, that was completely common sense. And what you just mentioned of your own experience on I think it was on GB News, correct? When would, if somebody would ask you, it's always difficult, but did you put your finger on where you think this was the breaking point, this was the watershed moment, or let's say that the watershed period, what would you identify? I mean, where do you think, because I completely agree both with your description and your assessment, but where do you think did it come from? Kind of, where is this self-hatred, if you want, where did it emerge from, or what is your theory about it?
I have three large dates, and I'll go in reverse order. 2011, David Cameron got elected. David Cameron terraformed the Conservative Party using racial and gender shortlists. He's written a Times piece in 2022 bragging about this. He said, we were a bunch of old, pale, stale white men, so I did something about it. And that has produced stellar politicians like Priti Patel, who has refused to apologise for the fact that she recalibrated immigration law and led to unprecedented world historical record level demographic change. David Cameron also passed the gay marriage bill and radically redefined the definitions of male and female in law to be functionally indistinguishable sexes. And he continued the Blairite project with both parties. So it meant that every single election henceforth has been a Hobson's choice, and you get mass immigration and cultural rewriting whether you like it or not. And the final thing about David Cameron is that under his stewardship is when RICU was set up and reconstituted. And they hired a guy called Richard Chalk, who was the chief of staff to Baroness Warsi, who is a Muslim baroness who constantly whined about Islamophobia, who yesterday got rid of the Conservative Party whip, who has set forth this new definition of Islamophobia. I don't know if you've heard this. It is Islamophobia is a kind of racism rooted in racism based on Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Now, if you can tell me what that actually means, I'll give you £100. But it turns out it's a de facto blasphemy law that the Labour Party are probably going to bring in. Very conservative. But her chief of staff ran RICU after he worked in Baghdad during the Iraq War for Bell Pottinger, promoting the Iraq War with the Labour Party. So again, they're one long party. 2011, that's one day. 1997 is the other day. The election of Tony Blair, when something happened. Immigration, net migration, hit the roof. And this put pressure on housing, it reconstituted cultural concerns, it set Brexit down the road in motion, but Tony Blair also waged insane cultural revolution and legislative revolution. He instituted the Climate Change Act, which established the Climate Change Committee, which meant that all of our climate commitments are set ahead of time, can't be withdrawn from the budget, and set us on the path to this insane net zero policy which you've spoken so eloquently about before. Constitutional Reform Act, he established the Supreme Court, he tried putting in a separation of powers which doesn't work in a constitutional monarchy and His Majesty's government. He introduced the Equality Act, which has created a legislative framework, much like the civil rights movement in America, that means that every single legal battle is one protected group versus another protected group, except if you're a heterosexual white Christian male, which it's just legal to hate and discriminate against you and exclude you from public life. 1997 is the other one. But the third one, the most contentious one, is 1945. And this has been recently revisited in the Tucker Carlson Darryl Cooper interview, which was controversial because Darryl Cooper made a number of erroneous claims, and I'll leave it to Andrew Roberts and Victor David Hanson to refute that. But I think the reason we're sort of circling the drain of the Second World War is because the politics in the aftermath of the Second World War are a paradigm that was set up for understandable reasons, but is now antiquated. So Winston Churchill, who is an avatar of Britain defeating Nazism, made some mistakes. Of course he did. Handing over the Cossacks to Stalin, knowing that the gulags were set up, for example. Terrible thing. But the reason that people, I think, are revisiting Churchill's legacy is because in the aftermath of the war, he helped establish the European Court of Human Rights and assented to the convention, which now is used to prevent the deportation of any foreign criminal appealing to their right to family life despite them, let's say, abusing a child. And he helped establish the UN 1952 Refugee Convention, which has caused all sorts of problems for evicting false refugees, mainly Muslim illegal migrants, grown males who are not fleeing conflict, or at least should be fighting in one if it's actually going on. It prevents them from getting rid of them from their country. And both of these acts were set up in mind with the Jews who had fled Germany, came to Britain, and some of whom were tragically expelled and sent back to their deaths. That was awful. But now that paradigm is not serving its purpose. But we can't move on from it, because anytime someone suggests it, what happens is exactly what you've said before. The politicians go, is that what Hitler would do? Ah, okay, then I can't do it, even if it's sensible. And so those three dates have, as well, of course, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the British Empire was dismantled, etc., etc. Those three dates, 1945, 1997, 2011, are very important to focus on, and anyone who wants to undo the shortcomings of this political paradigm should focus on all of the things that happened in those years.
But I think that's a fantastic point, right, that you just made. Because if you take something like the European Convention on Human Rights, I mean, these, whatever the intentions behind it were, those were entirely different times. Because you mentioned Nigeria before, just coincidentally, a couple of days back, I looked up the population development, the demographic development of Nigeria. In 1945, the UK still had significantly more people than Nigeria. Now Nigeria is on a course to have more inhabitants than the entire European Union, all of those 27 states. So this is kind of, we live in a different world now. In 1945, in the 1950s, a significant part of the world was still part of European colonial empires. Right? This idea that you can apply an international agreement that was conceived under entirely different circumstances is absurd. And I think you as you just said so eloquently, but why is nobody making that argument, like the one that you were just making, that one we were talking about? I think there is nothing wrong or morally reprehensible if you say, listen, this was decided in the 1950s, but we all know that this was usually always the left-wing argument, right? That, those were different times, and these documents should be organic and they must be interpreted in the light of what is going on contemporarily. But apparently when it comes to things like migration, then they say, no, we agreed on this in 1950, we agreed on this in 1954, you can no longer change it, you can never change it again.
So some politicians are saying we need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. There are infinitesimally few, only Liz Truss, while she was still an MP, said that we need to get rid of the UN and withdraw unless it substantially reforms. There are many commentators making them aware of this, but frankly, lots of politicians are quite stubborn. Lots of them don't want to do the boring work of combing through documents, or even if it's presented in a digestible format to them, don't think that they have the time to sit down and listen to an hour and a half presentation. They usually palm that off on their researchers. Very few of them are proper stats nerds, I suppose, like I am tended to be. But also lots of them are still trapped in this paradigm of optics and perceptions. And so the moment you say, I want to withdraw from the ECHR, very few politicians can get past that. But we have international commitments, and this was set up by Winston Churchill, and he's a national hero. And you don't want Britain to not be a world leader on the stage now, do you? Very few of them have the gumption to make difficult decisions. And as someone like, as we've seen at the UN recently, Nayib Bukele or Javier Milei turn around and say, well, your order hasn't worked. Here's how it substantially hasn't worked. Here's how my policies in my home country are working. And screw you if you disagree, because my loyalties is to the people that elected me. I think, frankly, the more politicians that did that, the more politicians that listened to explanations of why the ECHR or the UN or the Home Office and Raiku and the like are actively disservicing the people who have nowhere else to go if Britain falls, and the more politicians that turn around and go, the media and chattering class and a bunch of insane tyrants in the United Nations are whining at me about this, why would I care? Basically, the funny thing is, the more people that act, essentially, a bit like the Israelis, if more countries acted a bit like the Israelis and took matters into their own hands and had an unapologetic host majority, a thriving religious and national culture, a thriving GDP, thriving birth rate, and unapologetically defended their own citizens, and the moment they got condemnation from a bunch of raced communist crackpots at the International Court of Justice just went, sorry, we're having a developed country over here, we're having an actual civilization, you can enjoy your power cuts, I guess. The more politicians that decided to do that, I think we'd be much more successful.
But I think that's exactly the point. Isn't it an insult, or at least quite insidious? Because the hidden message, you could say, is that if there wouldn't be these international agreements, if there wouldn't be these international conventions, you would unleash the wrath of the British, and then, I don't know, they would put migrants into cattle cars, and they would set up concentration camps and whatnot. And the only thing that separates the British from descending into barbarism and genocide is some international convention, right? I mean, the British ideas, English ideas, the conceptualization of individuality, of human rights, of citizen rights, is much older than an agreement from the 1950s. So I'm fully on board with you, right? That politicians are, they're opportunists. They look where the wind is blowing. They don't necessarily, or not too many of them, like to go too much into depth. But the idea that your people are a raging mob, and the only thing that prevents them from lashing out is some international agreement. I mean, and by the way, the same in continental Europe. I make the same argument in Germany and also as well. I mean, that's a huge insult to the people. It's like we are not truly compassionate. The only thing that makes us compassionate is some legal framework we devised 80 years ago.
I don't think they've resolved this cognitive dissonance, though, because the exact kind of politicians that, let's say they've said they're committed to leaving the ECHR, but they're still not going far enough on immigration or the United Nations or various repealing bits of legislation that have been implemented by the Blair Revolution at home. I think they're the kinds of politicians that will turn around and go, well, of course the British Empire did good things. You know, the abolition of slavery in the 19th century was the single most expensive foreign aid venture ever conducted. Of course we should be proud about that. Of course we should be proud about ending bride-burning rituals in India. Britain shouldn't be ashamed of its entire history. They haven't connected that to the fact that it wasn't necessarily universal liberal Enlightenment values that did that. It's the moral sentiments and the traditions of the English, which were then, yes, packaged and exported as liberal values, but were fraught with false anthropologies and the inability to adapt to certain other traditions. See all the American ventures in Iraq trying to create a democracy, for example. They haven't connected it to the fact that before liberalism, before international conventions, before 1945 and its subsequent post-war order, the British didn't behave like genocidal barbarians. It's not in our character.
Precisely.
And it's also not generally in the character of most Europeans, besides the industrialized totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century. And I think all of those can be constrained with actually appeals to the national traditions of their various countries, rather than appeals to this universal liberalism, which fundamentally, like an autoimmune disorder, is incapable of defending against importing the same totalitarian ideologies in a slightly different form from the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. This is what Renaud Camus warned of when he said about the second career of Adolf Hitler. He didn't mean Hitler's going to rise from the grave. He meant that you are going to enact, essentially, the consequences of a Fourth Reich by not being able to exert cultural preference when enacting immigration policy. And the only way you can enact that cultural preference is if you abandon the value-neutral liberalism which you thought would bring an end to all wars, and instead say, no, we are beholden to a people, a place, a time, and a tradition. Tradition is the democracy of the dead, and so we must uphold it for the sake of our ancestors and for the sake of those yet to be born. And so we have a duty to preserve that national culture, that national population, and facilitate all of their desires that lead to their flourishing, and that is more important than an international treaties that we have pubs older than.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. Do you kind of kept some of my more intriguing questions for last, but I think we can still get through them. One is, do you think that there is a chance that there is also a backlash from a reactionary right? Because you alluded, and I think it's an important topic. Again, I'm fully with you. I leave it to the professional historians, but you alluded to this interview that Tucker Carlson did with Daryl Cooper, where a significant chunk of that conversation, a significant piece of the conversation was that actually Winston Churchill was the bad guy. And I'm wondering, is there a sense that on the right, the frustration with the current system and what they perceive as being the roots of the current system has reached such a level that on occasion, they're not fully there yet, but that on occasion they get very close to saying, you know what, maybe the Nazis weren't the baddies in World War II, like maybe it was us. And everything bad that the Nazis did was just, and this is in some areas Cooper's argument, right? It was just a matter of logistics. It was unfortunate. They weren't prepared for it. But overall, they were pushed into doing so, and then it unfortunately happened. But actually, again, it was the Churchills of the world that were the bad guys. That the frustration with the current state of the culture has reached such a level that they kind of want to throw out the baby and the bathwater and say everything that led to our current condition, including victory in World War II, is responsible for the situation in which we find ourselves. And I mean, Tucker Carlson was pretty much saying almost exactly that, right? He said, if you look at Britain right now, at the state of Britain, how can you doubt that things went downhill beginning with Churchill? But do you think this is also a danger? Some call it the woke right, the reactionary right. Do you think there's also a danger that it's not just extremism on the left, or ideological radicalism on the left, but there's also potentially a streak of ideological radicalism on the right that is gradually emerging?
Okay, so I want to distinguish, let's say, Carlson and Cooper out from the, let's be frank, neo-Nazis we do see on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Ever since October the 7th, there's been an increase in it, and I think it's because Israel has taken a prominence on the world stage, and so questions of Israeli foreign policy became predominant, and then questions of Israeli theology and culture became predominant, and then it just became the Jews. It's exhausting. I don't know what Carlson and Cooper have in their minds and hearts, so I'm not going to try and read it. I think that they got some of their history wrong, but I do also think, and I understand their criticisms of modern Britain in saying that there is a disjunction between the narrative we tell ourselves as the rightful vanquishers of genocidal totalitarianism on the continent, and then suddenly we can't defend our own culture against demographic onslaught and sort of hostile denigration from academia and media. But as for the emergence of a more violent, virulent, hard-bordered racialist and anti-Semitic right wing, I think what you can do to prevent that is actually engage with it rather than silo it off. Because, let's put it this way, I've got an essay coming out on IAN Substack soon that tries to steelman the sort of argument that Israel basically wants what we have, and because of the post-war order, we can't have it, and they have it at our expense. And there is definitely that perception out there. And who wouldn't want what Israel has? Again, strong religion, strong national culture, positive birth rates, high GDP per capita, strong borders, strong military, a cool martial art. Like, yeah, they've got some good stuff, right? And there's a perception, especially because of the, let's say, third rail of anti-Semitism, understandably, since the Second World War, that this topic can't be talked about, so it becomes taboo, so it becomes the only thing that certain people talk about, and then it suddenly feels that there's enough air that's been cleared where everyone can come out of the woodwork with an anonymous Twitter handle and start talking about it. What I think you do is instead you engage with them on the facts, for example, that Cooper got some of his facts around Churchill's timeline wrong, and then you say, but you're right, we should have exactly what Israel has. These are the shortcomings of the post-war and liberal paradigm, and we can have that without needing to resort to, actually, funnily enough, the failed venture of the Nazis, which didn't achieve what they wanted, and also without all of the, let's say, unsavory and violent actions that you might be thinking are necessary right now. I think, actually, the wrong tactic. And look, I'm okay with ideological gatekeeping, of course. You want to keep certain people out of the movement and not waste your time talking to them. But I will resist this term woke right. And again, I'm friends with Constantine. But woke right not only doesn't really mean anything, because wokeness, as Eric Kaufman has recently accurately defined it, is the making sacred of historically marginalized racial, sexual, and identity groups. Woke right doesn't make sense in that paradigm. What woke right really means is white identity politics and contrarian opinions that the left behind liberals don't like. And what I think needs to happen is the online right that are being called woke need to understand that Jewish people are not a homogenous ideological and ethnic bloc. Many of them aren't religious. Many of them don't even have the same ethnicities, and there's infighting between theirs. There are very patriotic Jews at NatCon. There are more liberal Jews that run Hope Not Hate. They both don't like each other either, so it's not one thing. And the liberals that have fallen into the right-wing camp need to understand that actually liberalism is not going to get them out of this. It's only strong majority host populations with particular cultures that act like tribes, that are allies, that is going to salvage this. So they need to get comfortable with majorities in Europe being ethnically and culturally conscious, and the online right needs to basically stop blaming the Jews for absolutely everything.
No, I think that makes sense. I think you're correct, right? There is kind of the right terms. It's always a matter of which terms one then actually wants to use to describe these things. But there has been a movement, as you also just described, that I find somewhat worrisome. I mean, some people might. You're right. Neither can I look into the people's hearts and souls. You don't know. But you have these very online individuals, right? Which just whether it's somebody like Daryl Cooper or somebody like Candace Owens, right? That it, as you said, there is more of this, right? And it's used in a much more, let's say, open fashion, right? Kind of saying the Jews are responsible for ABCD on Twitter or somewhere else. Or maybe the algorithm has changed. I don't know, but that seems to be much more common, right? And you have all these memes that say we all know who that is, right? Yep. Wink face, and yeah, we know what you mean. It's odd. I find it odd because I'm wondering. I'm just spitballing here. It's kind of final question. If we postulate that one thing, maybe, and probably would know this better than I do because you're part of the younger generation, that there is a sense that it's not just the ideological and cultural context of contemporary liberalism, but also the sense, and I think this is something that particularly members of the Muslim minorities feel, that it's a weak culture, right? It lacks a backbone. It's, to use the famous Osama bin Laden quote, right? When people see a strong horse and a weak horse, they instinctively prefer the strong horse. And that in search for kind of a strong Western cultural identity that some, not many I hope, but that some will take a second look. And I'm saying this analytically, not approvingly. They will take a look at fascism, right? They will take a look at the kind of the Mussolinis and, the like Mussolini with a shirtless on the beach, not dissimilar to Vladimir Putin, shirtless fishing. And all of a sudden this becomes attractive, not so much for the ideological and political content, but for the aesthetics of it, right? For the look of it. And I don't think that everybody on the left, right and center is immune to this. So I'm always befuddled that there is a risk that if people like Nigel Farage, if people like Niall Ferguson, if people like the AfD in Germany or the Republicans in the United States, if they don't show more of a backbone, they are not the final destination of whatever right-wingism is going to be. I think there is a danger that if more and more people feel that, you know what, you guys are also just telling us you're all these butch right-wingers who stand for our values, and as soon as you're in power or close to it, you forget everything you said yesterday, that more and more people will potentially take a second look at this more radical movement, and then you could hypothetically, right, this is the darkest scenario, you could have a re-emergence of these new movements, again, not for ideological and political reasons, but for aesthetics. And this is a topic you and I we have to save this for another podcast, so there's already an announcement for the next invitation. But there is an element of aesthetics in politics as well, right? A sense of identity, not just on the mind, but also a sense of identity, if you want, on the emotion, on the gut level. You want to be part of the strong, of the, not even manly or masculine, but of the winning culture, of the winning team. And this is something that I sense in some of those people that are now coming out with this, maybe, it's not just contemporary liberalism or contemporary cultural conditions, but it's everything that led to it.
Yeah, so I'll make 2 points on that. The first is that, again, looping back to the idea of Zoomers doing politics differently, don't underestimate the power of visual media on politics now. It got to the point where Rishi Sunak in the last election ran a little Dark Age edit about his military policy. That is only something that happens in like right-wing anon spheres. People are getting very terminally online, and so if aesthetics matter, then it can get to the point where in a, let's say, ugly, disorderly, hyper-feminine culture, symbolisms of hypermasculinity and orderliness can be valorized. This is very much the case with the trad accounts, with Catholicism, the beauty of the Vatican, classical sculpture. The Hellenists have clocked onto this with the Greco-Roman tradition. And there are elements of that Greco-Roman tradition that have evolved into Nietzscheanism, which then evolve into, weren't the uniforms of the 20th century very nice? And look, we've all seen this on Twitter. It's not worth pretending that it's not there. I don't know how large it is, given Douglas Murray's presence is far greater than the likes of those small anon accounts, but it is there, and it has grown. And the other element I would like to say is that be aware of accelerationist elements on that side, counter-signalling viable, sensible right-wing options, like Donald Trump, for example, so that they get what they want. There are a few figures, and I don't think it's worth naming them, but there are a few prominent figures who are all in for Kamala Harris because, one, they think it will basically collapse the American empire and lead to the rise of a more authoritarian, more race-based strongman, but also because in a eugenic fashion, they know that the Democrats' permissive abortion laws, just looking at places like New York, are going to lead to per capita disproportionate babies being killed among minorities. And they think it will win out in their favour. And this is a game they are playing with social media. They are being exoterically pro-Democrat, saying Trump is too soft, he's cucked, he's sold out. And esoterically, they are being utilitarian in their racial and political outcomes. And I would just warn people to be vigilant for it and not put your faith in false prophets.
No, I think no disagreement for my end. But exactly as you just said, I think there is this idea that is popular understandably on the left, probably more than on the right, that if you prevent people like Farage, like Trump, like the AfD, then if you prevent them from coming to power, then the only thing that can follow is whatever dream scenario they have in mind. But the alternative scenario, of course, is exactly what you described, that there are those, and I'm not sure, as I said, understanding is not approving. I'm not sure if they're entirely wrong, that they say, you know what, if we just keep pushing and pushing into one direction, if we allow the frustration in significant part of the population to reach critical mass, that at some point, the willingness to operate within the system will be replaced with the willingness to operate against the system. Because this is for me the big distinction when I look at, for example, the Nazis and the AfD. And whatever similarities or parallels one wants to construct, the AfD has never claimed that they want to, or they have no signs that they want to abolish the democratic system in Germany. They want to come to power within that system, right? Within those structures, within those checks and balances. Like the Nazis never made any secret out of their desire to abolish democracy. I mean, the great thing in a negative way, in a dark way, of many totalitarian and authoritarian ideologies, they always tell you exactly what they want to do. Like as you mentioned before, like from Hezbollah to the Nazis, they did not make a secret out of their plan. But that is, I think, the problem that we are gradually encountering is that at some point people will say, okay, if I cannot change the system from within, it is the entire system that I'm going to turn against. And you see this, I hear it now also in Austria. We have elections, federal elections on Sunday. And they're already much more than it was in the past. And I'm old enough to have a comparison where people say, yes, but mail-in ballots. Right? So already now in Austria we talk about that whatever the outcome of the election is, it's an improper election and somebody was cheating. And at some point, if more and more people start to believe that, for whatever reason, at some point you're going to say, there is no fair outcome, like there is no, like those who are supposed to be in power are deliberately kept from power, so therefore we need to revolt in whatever way or form against the entire system. And there will be demagogues, there will be individuals, there will be those who can channel that sentiment. And I think then you are potentially on a road to something similar to, it's never going to be exactly the same, but to something similar like a potential authoritarian / fascist movements? Or do you think that I'm overblowing this danger and that the systems are still strong enough and that this will all even itself out over the next couple of years?
I think if Trump's head had been slightly not tilted, America would be in civil war right now. It really is that precarious. And I mention that because when you say that demagogues can exploit the situation and discourage faith in democracy, the Democrats have done an exceptional job of that in the US, particularly with that Time magazine piece that said, we fortified the outcome. And their constant rhetoric saying that Trump is a threat to democracy. Now, I've done a long explanation of this for Ian Substack, but basically to them, democracy, premised on this liberal belief in an egalitarian human nature, democracy isn't the most popular person within our given electoral system wins a mandate to govern on behalf of the people. Democracy is the mechanism by which you enlighten everyone to their egalitarian human nature. And so, if they're not making progressive voting pattern choices in their presumed best interest, it must be because some divisive populist has come in and peddled misinformation and told them that we are all different, that we have cultural differences, that we have gender differences, etc. And so anyone preventing equality is a threat to democracy, and so you are justified, in the minds of the Democrats, to escalate the threat to an existential level until someone crazy in your base, or two, or even more as the threat keeps escalating and Trump's life is on the line, take a shot because they think Hitler's about to be elected, I better prevent Hitler because Hitler is the boogeyman, and understandably so, but Trump is not Hitler, clearly. So, the worst thing the politicians can do is basically back off, is soften, is try and acquiesce to an enemy that would rather see them dead than win an election. The worst thing Reform can do is cave to the media. The worst thing Trump can do is, and I don't think he's doing this, but other than maybe on some issues, is lie down and play into the Democrats' dialectic, where they depict him as the boogeyman, they depict him as unpopular, and he's constantly on the back foot and fighting. I think his defensive posture in the Harris debate was actually a bit weaker than it was with the sort of authoritative statesman in the Biden debate. I think he should go back to that. But the worst thing they can do is soften. What they can do instead to both avert disaster and actually service the people within the legitimate democratic mechanisms that we operate in at the moment is be like Nayib Bukele. Nayib Bukele was elected twice. In the second term, he had a 90% approval rating, won over 80% of the vote. He gave a fantastic speech on the balcony to his enthused supporters, and he locked up, I think it was 1% of the population? It turns out they were all criminals and you could identify them because they had bloody head tattoos for doing so. And El Salvador has gone from the murder capital of the world to the safest place in the southern hemisphere. It's prosperous, it's peaceful, and he has serviced his people, and he has been absolutely unapologetic about doing so, even when the New York Times calls him a racist authoritarian. You can just do that. You can uphold the law in spite of the whining liberals in the media and your opposing political classes. You can be transparent about governance. You can ensure that you deliver cost-effective services to the people that elected you. And guess what? You actually keep getting elected, and you don't need to be, let's say, Caesar after he saved the Republic, and people brandish knives for him for a reason.
But that's the point, right? If you take Samatar Bukele, who is accused, for example, by the New York Times of being an authoritarian, the actual argument should be that precisely because he showed to his voters that voting makes a difference, that you can vote somebody into office that will improve your living conditions, that democracy is working. Like in many ways, I would argue, he is an example for democracy functioning, not the opposite.
Quite, yes. And I would say that currently the political system in the UK, where Keir Starmer got fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn, but more seats, and set about immediately calling the majority of the country far right, and is now tanking in popularity after various scandals about potential corruption for accepting donations for clothes and Taylor Swift tickets while cutting the winter fuel allowance for the poorest pensioners, and, funnily enough, as it's been calculated by Conservative MP Nick Timothy, over doubling the asylum budget by rubber stamping applications, putting it all into the welfare budget and adding 17 billion a year to the already 14 billion bill, one would say democracy's taken a bit of a knock in the UK. And so if in the next 5 years something like Farage and Reform cannot mobilise and represent the authentic interests and the necessary policies that are needed to get Britain back on track, I do fear for the very unpredictable future of this country.
My last question, as a more almost a yes or no question. Do you think that maybe the true dividing line between a democratic and an undemocratic leader is that one of them thinks he's entitled to rule and somebody else thinks that they have to earn it to rule? Because this is what I see with our current establishment all over the West. The Keir Starmers, the Kamala Harrises, the Olaf Scholzes, you name it, the Emmanuel Macrons. It seems to me that they no longer think that they are accountable to the people and that they need the approval of the people, the confirmation of the people. No, they think they're entitled to rule, and at worst, the people get it. At best, they ignore the people, and at worst, they treat the people as if they're an obstacle.
I think yes, and I think that entitlement is derivative of the ideology that says you are all egalitarian, and by virtue of me knowing that, because I've read the ideology that is the apotheosis of philosophy at the Enlightenment, I alone, as a philosopher king, am entitled to steward history along its own long arc bending towards social justice. So I can take whatever action I think is in your best interest, such as banning smoking outside pubs or locking up people for Facebook posts. And I think the problem with that entitlement is that the elite class, their reach exceeds their grasp. And I think that they think they're going to get Kumbaya, John Lennon's imagined technological utopia. Instead, I think they're going to get hyper-diversified, collapsing South Africa. And excuse me if I don't want to live through that particular apocalypse.
On that uplifting note, Conor Tomlinson, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.